Hi, my name is Audrey Kitagawa, and I'm the president and founder of the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation and president of the Light of Awareness International Spiritual Family. Today on this show, we will talk about the importance of our values and our personal responsibility to make this world a better place.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Hey, do me a favor. Would you send me a note, a DM on one of the four big social media outlets and tell us, how are you listening to the show? What platforms are you using? Are you using Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcast? Wherever you're listening to us, do me a favor, tell us where it is. Send us a message saying that. Tell us one of your favorite episodes, and I'm going to pick a winner for a $1,500 prize for everyone who participates. I'll pick somebody out. Could be you. So go on to those outlets and let us know where you are listening to the show and what's your favorite episode. I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty. What do you need to do to uplevel your leadership? Let me ask you that. How about re-examining our global economic path through the lenses of spirituality? Now, before you go, I'm not into all that woo-woo stuff, what might happen if your results as an organization and as an individual got way better because you made those changes? Well, stay tuned, because that's where we're going on today's show. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. This episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by our other podcast, Curiosity Bites. Curiosity Bites is the answer to the question, how can we bring people together who completely disagree? This is exactly what your heart, your mind, your very soul has been craving. It's your chance to sit in on some real and oftentimes intense conversations with some of the world's most interesting people. We're talking about astronauts, economists, neuroscientists, philosophers, holy people, quantum physicists, skeptics, entrepreneurs, multi-award-winning Grammy award-winning entertainers. It's truly fascinating people. Simply go to dovbaron.com and find out how you can sign up for and sink your teeth into the delicious Curiosity Bites. We always need your help in staying relevant, so please get over to wherever you tune into the podcast and do us a favor, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And please share the show with everybody you know. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And we are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. Business and leadership are in many ways the driving force of modern living. But have we lost our way? The idolization of individualism and materialism has created a global economic structure that is deeply reliant on extractive industries that many would argue are destroying the planet. The truth is, we have created a global economic system that is in many ways a runaway train. Therefore, as leaders, we have a responsibility to ask, is there a better, more wholesome, more connected way to do business, to do leadership, for that matter, to do living, moving forward in a way that's based on multicultural cooperation? Well, let's find out together, because we have a very special guest today. Our guest today is Audrey Kitagawa. Now, she is a former advisor to the Office of Special Representatives for the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict in the United Nations. Audrey has been listed in the who's who, wait for this, who's who of American law, who's who of American women, who's who of Americans and predominant people of Hawaii, recipient of the Medal of the Pride of Eurasia. She is the president and founder of International Academy of Multicultural Cooperation, president of the Light Awareness International Spiritual Family. She is the United Nations representative for the United Religions Initiative, the UN Cooperation Circle, and the chair of Emerita of the Community of Spirituality, Values, and Global Concerns, New York. She has written and been extensively published, including articles in World Affairs, the Journal of International Issues, including The Power of Om, Transformation of Consciousness for Practical Spirituality. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome the extraordinary leader who, among all other things, is the recipient of the Spirit of the UN Award, which is given to outstanding individuals who have demonstrated the vision of the Spirit the United Nations has expressed through the UN Charter and Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Audrey Kitagawa! Welcome, Audrey.
Thank you so much, Dove, for having me.
There's a lot to get through. You are a very accomplished lady. My goodness me. Thank you for joining us. We are honored.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you. And I'm looking forward to doing this podcast with you on leadership and loyalty.
Thank you. So where we always like to start is, there are very obvious things in leadership and very obvious questions that seem to need to be answered. But in the context of leadership development, what do you believe is the question we should be looking for the answers to that we're probably kind of skipping over and we're not really paying attention to? What is the question we need to look to the answer of?
Well, leadership and all the indices of leadership is very important to be able to see who the leader is. And the hallmarks of good leadership is not only competence in the fields in which you purport to lead, but also the fact that you have that grounding in a moral, ethical, spiritual base, and that you have done your homework on the search for the greater meaning of life. And that will always place you within that sacred ground of being from which we have all arisen, to which we will all return, and to which we are always connected. And in that sacred ground of being are the universal values that join all of us together. And those universal values are love, peace, harmony, and joy.
So so in that context, is the question that we're not looking for the answer to that we need to is, what is the meaning for me? What is the greater meaning in our lives, rather than the meaning of profit, which is often the driving, or profit or power is the driving force of a lot of leadership. We need to look at the spiritual meaning, like what is the meaning of my life?
That is correct. And of course, that is the eternal perennial search. And, people have been asking this question from the beginning of time, who am I? And of course, all of the great spiritual masters and mystics have posed that question to all of us, because ultimately, when we take on form and structure, we all understand that our mortality in form and structure is limited. Shelf life is limited. And therefore, while we are dancing upon this earth in this form and structure, we are always searching for that essence of life that transcends the limitation of form and structure. And therefore, we want to know, how are we spending our time while we have this time in this body? And, this is where the deep meaning of life comes from, because we have to be willing to see how we are living our lives and what we are committing our life force to. Because whatever we commit our life force to, we are giving in terms of the unit of time. And of course, in the third dimensional plane, we have the perception of time and space. And necessarily in that context of form and structure arises. Now, form and structure, as we all know, will ultimately go back to dust. And so therefore, while we are in this body, we have to do the deep inquiry. Am I busy doing things that ultimately do not have any value, but staying busy without making the kind of contribution that we in our hearts feel that we should be making? And that would be going back again to the values that we embrace, and that would be to see how we can make this world a better place. And to our dismay, in when you live in the world of duality, the good, the bad, the happy, the sad, you're always moving between the pairs of opposites. And in fact, our brain is divided in half. And so we have, the half of the body, the right half, the left half, and etc. So the pairs of opposites always go together. But we want to ultimately be able to come to that state of transcendence where peace is. But to be able to find that sacred ground of being, and it is an inner search, it does require undertaking your homework to do that. Even though it is.
Let me just jump in for a second, Audrey, because
okay.
I think I want to make sure that we are speaking the language of our audience. So, as you may know or may remember from our previous conversations, my background is deeply spiritual, having studied and traveled with great teachers from around the world. And I found myself in the world of business and leadership and guiding leaders. We can talk about the polar responses of right, wrong, black, white, left, right, etc. And in the context of leadership, that is often perceived as certainly right and wrong, but profit and loss as well. And I fully agree with you that we need a transformation in the world of leadership. But at the same time, this piece that is vital is this understanding of the framework the listener is in, not just our listener here, but the listener as in those in leadership, is, well, the nuts and bolts, the form, quote unquote, as you talked about before, is I have a business, I am a human being, I employ other human beings. We have to make profit to employ those people, to feed their families. This is the nuts and bolts of it. And that's where it tends to get off course, because it's very easy then for them to say, well, if this is the nuts and bolts of it, I'm going to dismiss this, quote, spiritual realm. And you bring it back to something that I want our viewers and listeners to grasp, which is this understanding of multiculturalism. So can we sort of take it into that form for a moment to have them sort of get it in a very tangible way?
Well, I think, you framed it very beautifully at the very beginning of this conversation when you talked about the business and leadership. Have we lost our way? Individualism versus materialism. So right there, you're framing it in the polarity. Mm-hmm. And you said we have created global leaders. Is there a better way to do leadership based on multicultural cooperation? And of course, what globalization has taught us is that we are all interconnected and interdependent, and we have created those systems that have magnified our interdependence. And of course, all of our, informational technologies have allowed us to be connected anywhere in the world and to be able to see the suffering of people, the tragedies that are all taking place in different parts of the world instantly. Mm-hmm. And we never had access to those kinds of technologies before, but those technologies just reveal what has always been there. Yes. And that is we are interconnected. But the global financial systems that we have set up magnify the fact that we are interdependent and interconnected, not only in the financial flows and in our trade, but in all of the cultures that are expressed in the magnitude of the diversity of the cultures. And it also allows us the opportunity to transcend those cultures, even as we get together and celebrate the beauty, the magnificence of the different foods, the dances, the songs that bring us into that heart of connectivity, but to also to be able to understand that transcending all of the isms and the perceptual field of diversity is this common humanity that we have. We recognize that we are all human beings, and more than just the species of Homo sapien is the fact that we are one of many species in the animal kingdom, in the mineral kingdom, in all the different kingdoms, and that we are all interconnected and interdependent. And therefore, ultimately, the values that we uphold must be to honor and respect the sacredness of all of life.
Yeah, we're all earthlings in our own form. Whether you're a caterpillar, whether you're a butterfly or you're a human being or any of that, we're all earthlings. Now, this again, when even in the way that you're speaking, obviously you're very deeply a spiritual person, and that obviously I support and salute that. But nobody's journey is a straight line. I mean, you've talked about all these wonderful honors that you've been given, who's who of law and all these different backgrounds. So that nobody's journey is a straight line. You've got a very, very accomplished journey. It's like I said, it's never a straight line. If you don't mind, please share with us the turning point for you. I mean, I'm assuming that the background is in law because you were who's who of law. It's very, it's the academic, the business side of things. What was the turning point for you in your life, in your leadership, in your personal and business philosophy?
Well, the turning point in my life was really meeting very enlightened, my spiritual mother. And when I met her, she instantly saw me, pointed her finger at me, and she said, "You cannot serve two masters." Somehow in my heart, I knew exactly what she meant. And then she started a 5-hour beautiful exposition on the divine that one could ever have the privilege to hear. And she spoke in a language that was unusual, language that I had not heard before. But there was an embodied truth and a deep, deep love that I felt from her. And she imparted such sacred wisdom and simultaneous peace. And, she said, "I am transmitting to you, spirit to spirit, heart to heart, infinite to infinite, and not mind to mind. And whatever you may need of what I have transmitted to you will spontaneously arise when you need it." She has been true to her word. Whenever I have needed to hear those profound transmissions, they do spontaneously arise. And I consider it a great privilege to have met her, to have been in her presence, to have heard the language of the divine spirit, and to be transformed by it. Because that kind of peace, while I was in her presence, that truly surpasses any understanding, is something that never leaves you. And you are literally transformed. And that kind of transformation, you never really go backwards from. So it's the insight, the awareness, and the unfolding of like a beautiful flower coming into the fullness and beauty of its potential. When it blooms, it is like a slow bloom, unless you're watching time-elapse photography. But in the natural world, these things unfold in its own time and slowly. And so, but it was like that beautiful, beautiful implantation in my heart, in my soul, that totally changed my perceptual field and
May
how
I ask you who that was?
I'm sorry?
May I ask you who the teacher was?
We call her Divine Mother, but her name was Flora Nomi. And she was born and raised on the island of Oahu in the little sugar town of Waipahu. And oftentimes, these great beings are unknown.
Of course.
And they have very humble backgrounds.
Was she Huna Kahuna?
No, she was not affiliated in that sense with the Native Hawaiian indigenous wisdom, but in the deeper sense was definitely connected to it, because all
Beautiful.
sacred wisdom arises from this universal.
Of course.
Mhm.
That's beautiful. So before that, who was Audrey before that? How were you operating in the world before that? Because as I said, there are going to be people watching and listening to us who are like, well, that's way out there for me. But that is not, you were not that person before. So who were you before?
Well, of course, I grew up in a Japanese family, third and fourth generation, respectively, from Japan, but born and raised in Hawaii. And of course, for the Hawaiian Japanese, much of our life was informed by the context of World War II and the attack on Pearl Harbor. So we have our own history there with respect to experiencing, the blackouts. My paternal grandfather was put into, at that time, a secret internment camp. And of course, many of the Japanese who lived in the coastal cities were considered to be security threats, and so were removed by executive order of the president to internment camps. So many of them were citizens, American citizens.
Yes.
And so that is part of the history of the Japanese people living in Hawaii and in the US at that time. So, it was a incredible in looking at the historical context, this intersectionality of government policy, whether it's through executive order, as well as through the instrument of the judiciary, because the US Supreme Court in the famous Korematsu case also affirmed the concentration camps and the relocation of the people. In a relatively recent Supreme Court case, by way of some dicta and holding with respect to the Korematsu case, but was not in prime. It was in reference to a case that it was made reference to in another case that was primary. And the Chief Justice Roberts said that the court of history, basically would declare that the Korematsu case should be vacated. So, but in any event, it is interesting to see how also it played out in the cultural context in Hawaii as well, because our local Japanese newspapers were closed. Many of the Japanese language schools were closed. The religious leaders were moved away. And so the cultural life of the people were also heavily interrupted. So that is,
what I'm actually asking about is your sort of professional and mindset before you met your spiritual mother. So in the context of, were you a very logical thinking person, or were you already on a quote spiritual path before that?
Well, I've always had a very profound and transformative, shall we say, mystical experiences, for lack of a better term, but that always informed me about a deeper reality that that exists. And so in any event, but growing up in an Asian family, education was exceedingly important.
Sure.
So it was mandatory that we all have a college education. And of course, as part of the American policy, assimilation was very important as well.
Yes.
So, we spoke English, and of course, the striving for that education, because frankly, my mother only had a fifth grade education. When I became a sophomore in high school, she said, okay, I'm the youngest of five. So she said, okay, now my baby is in high school, so I'll go back to school. So she went on to night school, and in 2 years, she got her high school diploma. it was a very proud moment for her. We took her out to dinner. We attended her graduation ceremony. So she was very instrumental in making our higher education absolutely mandatory. So initially, because I was a type of child that picked up the stray cats, the wounded bird, and so, was always present for members of my family who were ill, and I was like the little nurse. And so I thought I'd go into being a doctor. But I had to realize that my competencies were not in math and science. So I decided at that time, I will be a lawyer where I can actually help to work in, issues of justice and, help write the laws, et cetera. So I made a commitment to become a lawyer. And then from that point on, once I made that decision, after volunteering to be a candy striper, working at the Rehab Center of the Pacific, et cetera, I actually had my mother enter into a contract with me that she would honor my request to be a volunteer candy striper. So my mother was so stunned that I would present her, I was just a kid, write a contract and ask her to sign it. So I thought I had some inherent talent already.
Law. The creating agreements and law.
Yeah, so she did sign it, and I did too, and she had to stick with her agreement. And so in any event, whatever I decided to do, I gave my whole heart and attention to. And so I decided I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to go for my education on the West Coast and the East Coast. And somehow, when you are meant to do something and you make that decision, it's as if the whole universe supports you in allowing it to unfold in that direction. So I was able to become a lawyer. I practiced law in Hawaii for 20 years and, really was married to the legal profession. I just loved being a lawyer in
But as
Hawaii.
I said, that's a very logical, rational business to be in. And you went on to become, and this is fascinating for me because Andrew Feinstein has been a guest on my show who wrote a lot about this, written several books. He actually served under Mandela as an MP as well. But you became an advisor to the Office of Special Representatives for the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict at the United Nations. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because, armed conflict is horrendous. The corruption that goes on inside of the industrial complex is crazy. But you were advising around children caught in these conflicts. Talk to us a little bit about how that came about and the progress of that, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, I initially came to New York City from Hawaii to help with this organization that was created by Mikhail Gorbachev. And so they always had their international convenings in San Francisco. And for the millennium, they wanted to have a convening in conjunction with the opening of the UN General Assembly. So I helped the organization by coming to New York, and it was only supposed to be for 6 months. As part of the international conference, we did a lot of outreach to secure keynote speakers and, of course, heads of state. And because it was going to be in conjunction with the opening of the UN General Assembly, it maximized our ability to do outreach to heads of state to come to our event, which was being held at one of the hotels nearby. So as part of the outreach, I went to the Office of the Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict and did the invitation to the Special Representative to be a keynote speaker. And it started our conversation, et cetera. And at the conclusion of the conference, we had further conversation, and he invited me to go and be his advisor So the next thing you know, I am in the United Nations. And I was only going to be in New York, as I said, for 6 months, but then I stayed. And it was really fascinating work. Basically, it was advocacy work. There's advocacy work and there's field work. The office was an advocacy office, and it was advocating for children affected by war. So it also included, doing a lot of public outreach, et cetera. And I actually did visit the Congo, which was Democratic Republic of Congo, which at that time was in conflict. And so I did a lot of visits with women on the ground and had a lot of firsthand experience seeing the status of children who also, there were a lot of homeless children. And I saw toddlers taking care of toddlers. They slept at graveyards. It was all very, very sad. And I also did an assessment of the status of children in rock mines. So, young children and their families to try to make a living, sat in the hot sun all day long, just making little chips, I guess, for gravel for the road, and just pounding on rock all day long in the hot sun. And, the status of the people was very, very sad. I visited the prisons, and especially the women prisons, and got to learn about, the incredible suffering of women on the ground, especially in conflict areas.
Yes.
And yes, the UN Resolution 1325 has since made, rape, et cetera, sex crimes against women a violation, but, not to be used as a weapon of war. Well, it should not be used in any event. But, this whole aspect of becoming aware of the disparity in treatment of gender. And that was very important. And of course, we still see the disparities playing out in different ways in different countries. And that also arises within a cultural context. So when you understand, study better about the histories, whether it's of religious institutions, whether it's of countries, whether of the different cultures, the treatment of women and the place that women have in these societies, these institutions, organizations, et cetera, is very telling. And I would like to say this, that the women are the powerful agents of transformation.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely.
And part of my work is to see that, women rise to the forefront of leadership. I think that's very important.
Yeah,
and all across.
We need more women leaders than we've ever needed. We've always need them. We definitely need them. And one of my personal philosophy is that the world is changed by three groups of people, and that doesn't include old white men. We like to think that old white men are in charge, and they may have a lot of the power, but the difference is that the people who can really make the change are women, because they whisper in the ears of their children, and by that they direct the future. It is changed by them. It is changed by youth, because they are willing to fight for something that they see as wrong, that a previous generation may have been willing to accept. And the third group are the artists, the creatives, those who are willing to express the unexpressible. They are willing to say the thing that cannot be said. They are willing to show the thing that is nobody's willing to see. And this is why, I support comedians and actors and writers and all those kinds of people, because they are actually the spiritual foundation for much of the change that takes place in the world. So we need to empower women, we need to empower the youth, and we need to empower the creatives, so that we can push a lot of the stodgy old white guys out of the way. Hey, and I'm an old white guy, so push the stodgy old white guys out of the way so that we can have the change that we need, that becomes the foundation for multicultural understanding that you talked about. Now we're going to take a break because we're already at the end of part one. I'm going to come back for part two of the show, and I really want to sort of dive deeper into this whole thing of understanding this multicultural cooperation, which I know you're huge into. I want to not only talk more about it, but I want to put the practicality of it. So when we come back in part two, I'm going to be asking Audrey to share with us, with you, how we can step up, what we can do in a very practical sense to make a difference, to be part of a multicultural cooperation and really guiding ourselves back to stop being a runaway train and be better leaders in our homes, in our communities, in our companies, and of course in our countries. So we're going to be back in one click. You just click away and you can join us for part two of my delicious conversation with Audrey Kitagawa. And we will see you in one click. Till then, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious. Audrey, where can people find out more about you and what it is you do?
You can go to our website at www.multiculturalcooperation.net.
Fabulous. We'll see you on part two coming up.